June 25th, 1876, Montana Territory. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer stands on a hill overlooking what his scouts are desperately trying to tell him is the largest Native American encampment they've ever seen. The village stretches for 3 miles along the Little Bighorn River. His scouts estimate between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors down there. Maybe more. Custer has 210 men. His officers are begging him to wait for reinforcements. But Custer, the golden-haired boy general who's never lost a battle, who dreams of presidential runs and magazine covers, waves them off. He's George Armstrong Custer. He doesn't wait for anyone. 2 hours later, every single one of those 210 men is dead. And here's what makes this story absolutely haunting. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't superior enemy tactics. It was something far more dangerous. A general so drunk on his own legend that he couldn't see reality anymore. And he's not alone.
Throughout military history, some of the most catastrophic defeats haven't come from weak armies or poor weapons. They've come from commanders who were so certain of victory that they marched their troops straight into annihilation. Let me show you how confidence became the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. We need to talk about why overconfidence is so uniquely dangerous in warfare. See, in most areas of life, being overconfident might cost you money or embarrassment. In war, it costs lives, thousands of them. And the higher up the chain of command you go, the more devastating those mistakes become. One general's bad call can destroy an entire army in an afternoon. Military historians have a term for this: victory disease. It's what happens when a commander becomes so intoxicated by past successes that they start believing their own invincibility. They stop gathering intelligence, they dismiss warnings, they underestimate opponents. The pattern is so common, so predictable, and yet century after century, generals keep falling into the same trap. Let's start with Custer because his story encapsulates everything that can go wrong when ego overrides judgment. By 1876, Custer had built himself into a legend. During the Civil War, he'd been the youngest general in the Union Army at 23. Newspapers loved him. He loved newspapers even more. He wore custom uniforms with gold trim, grew his blonde hair long, and made sure photographers knew where to find him. After the war, he became famous for campaigns against native tribes, particularly the 1868 Battle of Washita, where he'd attacked a Cheyenne village. But here's what's crucial to understand. That Washita victory planted a seed of arrogance that would grow into a fatal delusion. Custer had split his forces, attacked at dawn, and caught the village by surprise. In his mind, this proved a formula. Divide your troops, strike fast, and native warriors would scatter. He'd built an entire theory of warfare on one successful surprise attack against a peaceful winter camp. So when General Alfred Terry gave Custer wide latitude to pursue Sitting Bull's forces in June 1876, Custer made the same assumptions he always did. He refused 4 additional companies of cavalry. He turned down Gatling guns. When his Crow and Arikara scouts, people who actually knew these warriors, told him the village was massive, he dismissed them. One scout named Bloody Knife reportedly told him, "We're all going to die." Custer responded that they'd captured villages before and could do it again. On June 25th, even after seeing clear evidence of the massive encampment, Custer divided his already small force into 3 separate battalions. He was still operating under the assumption that Native Americans would flee rather than fight. He couldn't conceive that this time, with Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and several thousand warriors defending their families, they might stand and fight. And not just fight, annihilate. The engagement lasted less than an hour. Custer and every man under his direct command were killed. His overconfidence had led him to make virtually every wrong decision possible, refusing reinforcements, ignoring intelligence, dividing his forces, and attacking an enemy whose strength he'd willfully refused to acknowledge. Now, you might think this is a uniquely American story, or maybe something specific to 19th century warfare. But let me take you to France. October 25th, 1415. The Battle of Agincourt. The French army has assembled approximately 20,000 to 30,000 men, knights in the finest armor money can buy, mounted on powerful war horses representing the flower of French nobility. Facing them are roughly 6,000 English soldiers, most of them common archers, exhausted from weeks of marching, ravaged by dysentery, starving, barely able to stand. On paper, this shouldn't even be a contest. The French outnumber the English at least 3-1, possibly 5-1, and the French know it. The night before battle, French soldiers are singing songs of victory. Some have brought special carts to parade the captured English king through Paris. They're not planning for battle, they're planning the celebration. Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, and Boucicaut, the Marshal, both experienced military men, are urging caution. They want to surround the English, cut off their supplies, and force surrender without risking battle. It's the smart strategy, the safe strategy. But the younger French nobles won't hear it. They're insulted at the very suggestion of anything other than direct confrontation. They don't want to win through siege and starvation. Where's the glory in that? They want a charge, a proper knightly assault, so they can prove their valor and collect ransoms from captured English nobles. The experienced commanders are overruled. The attack will be frontal, immediate, and overwhelming. Except here's what the overconfident French didn't account for: terrain. The battlefield at Agincourt is a recently plowed field, narrowed by woods on both sides, and it's been raining for days. The ground is soft mud, and the French cavalry, in their 50-kilogram suits of armor, are about to charge across it directly into a storm of English longbow arrows. The English archers could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. With about 5,000 archers, that's potentially 50,000 arrows per minute filling the air. And yes, the French armor could resist many of these arrows at long range, but the mud slowed them to a crawl. The narrow field funneled them into a killing zone where they couldn't maneuver. Arrows found gaps in armor, struck horses, hit exposed faces when knights lifted visors to see. The French front ranks fell. The ranks behind trampled over them, pushing forward in the mud, unable to turn back because more men kept pressing from behind. Contemporary accounts describe French knights drowning in mud beneath their fallen comrades, so tightly packed together they couldn't even swing their swords. The battle became a slaughter. Conservative estimates put French losses between 6,000 and 10,000 men, including a devastating proportion of French nobility. English losses were in the hundreds. The tragedy is that this was completely avoidable. The experienced French commanders knew better. They'd advised differently. But overconfidence in superior numbers and traditional knightly tactics overrode tactical sense, and France lost a generation of military leadership in a single afternoon because younger nobles refused to believe that peasant archers could threaten armored knights. So we're seeing a pattern here, right? Commanders ignoring good advice, underestimating opponents, assuming past successes guarantee future victories. But let me show you where this pattern reaches its ultimate expression. Let's talk about Napoleon in Russia. Napoleon Bonaparte is at the absolute peak of his power. He's conquered most of Europe, Prussia, Austria, Spain, all either defeated or allied with France. He's won seemingly impossible victories at Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. Military academies study his tactics. Enemies fear him. His own troops believe he's invincible. And this belief, shared by millions, is about to kill hundreds of thousands of them. Napoleon assembles the largest invasion force Europe has ever seen, over 600,000 soldiers from France and allied territories. It's called the Grande Armée, and it's magnificent. Trained, equipped, led by veteran commanders who've won battle after battle, Napoleon's strategy seems simple: march into Russia, force a decisive battle, crush the Russian army, compel Tsar Alexander I to submit. He's done this in Austria, he's done it in Prussia. Why would Russia be different? Here's what Napoleon knew intellectually but refused to internalize. Russia was fundamentally different from every other nation he'd conquered. The distances were vast, the roads were terrible, the population was sparse, supplies would be scarce. He'd read accounts of Charles XII's failed Swedish invasion a century earlier. He understood the challenges. He even set up supply depots in Poland and organized thousands of wagons to transport provisions. But Napoleon's confidence in his ability to force a quick, decisive battle trumped all these concerns. He'd defeated every European army he'd faced. Why would Russia be any different? The answer? Because the Russians refused to play by his rules. General Mikhail Kutuzov, commanding the Russian forces, understood something critical. Napoleon's entire system depended on decisive battles. Deny him that battle and his advantages evaporated. So the Russians retreated, and retreated, and retreated. They fought when they had to, The Battle of Borodino on September 7th was catastrophically bloody. But they never committed to the kind of total engagement Napoleon needed to win the war in one stroke. Instead, they pulled back, burned crops and supplies as they went, and forced Napoleon to chase them deeper into Russian territory, while his supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Napoleon captured Moscow in mid-September, expecting surrender. Instead, he found an abandoned city that mysteriously caught fire, destroying much of its shelter and supplies. He waited 5 weeks in Moscow for peace negotiations that never came. 5 weeks while Russian winter approached, while his cavalry horses starved, while his supply situation grew desperate. When Napoleon finally ordered retreat in mid-October, disaster followed. The retreat from Moscow became one of history's greatest military catastrophes. Soldiers froze, starved, were picked off by Russian cavalry and partisan fighters, crossed the Berezina River in chaotic scenes where thousands drowned or were trampled. Of the 600,000-plus soldiers who'd entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 staggered back out. Some estimates put Napoleon's total losses, dead, captured, deserted, at over 500,000 men. What killed them? Not primarily the Russian winter, despite popular belief. Most losses occurred in summer and autumn due to disease, starvation, and combat. The cold delivered the final blow to an army already destroyed by Napoleon's fundamental miscalculation, his confidence that he could force Russia to fight on his terms. He'd assumed his previous victories proved his invincibility. He was wrong. And here's the cruel irony. Napoleon's failure in Russia didn't come from lack of planning. He'd planned extensively. It came from believing that his genius and past successes could overcome logistical realities and an opponent willing to sacrifice territory for time. His confidence had become a form of blindness. So what's actually happening in these commanders' minds? Why do intelligent, experienced military leaders keep making these catastrophic mistakes? Military psychologists and historians have studied this extensively, and the pattern that emerges is terrifying in its consistency. First, there's a phenomenon called availability bias. Generals remember their victories more vividly than defeats, especially their own victories. Custer remembered Washita. Napoleon remembered Austerlitz. The French nobles at Agincourt remembered generations of knightly dominance. These memories become templates that the mind automatically applies to new situations, even when circumstances are completely different. Second, there's confirmation bias. Once a commander decides on a course of action, they unconsciously filter incoming information to support that decision. Custer's scouts said the village was huge. He heard what he wanted. Napoleon's officers warned about logistics. He focused on battle plans. The French commanders at Agincourt advised caution. The nobles heard cowardice. Third, and this is crucial, there's the intoxication of command. The higher you rise in military hierarchy, the more your decisions are validated by success and deferred to by subordinates. You become surrounded by people who rarely contradict you. You start to believe that your judgment is superior not just in degree but in kind. Dissenting voices get dismissed not as alternate perspectives, but as failure to understand your genius. Victory disease compounds all of this. Each success makes the next defeat more likely, because it reinforces the dangerous belief that your methods are universally applicable. It creates a ratchet effect where confidence builds but wisdom doesn't. You become less cautious, not more, with each triumph. But here's what makes this truly insidious. Overconfidence doesn't feel like overconfidence from the inside. It feels like clarity. It feels like courage. It feels like the kind of decisive leadership that wins battles. The general who ignores warnings and attacks anyway doesn't think he's being reckless. He thinks he's being bold. The commander who refuses reinforcements doesn't think he's being arrogant. He thinks he's being efficient. This is why the pattern repeats. It's not that generals are stupid or deliberately ignore obvious dangers. It's that overconfidence creates a cognitive distortion where dangers become invisible and bad decisions feel like good ones. The mind protects the ego from information that challenges its self-image. Let me give you one more example that brings all this together, because it happened within living memory, and we can trace the decision-making process in excruciating detail. Operation Barbarossa, June 1941. Adolf Hitler orders the invasion of the Soviet Union with 3.5 million Axis troops. Hitler had reason for confidence. In 2 years, Germany had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. The mighty French army, considered one of the world's finest, had collapsed in 6 weeks. Britain stood alone. Hitler's military machine seemed unstoppable. His generals had refined blitzkrieg tactics to devastating effectiveness. Why would Russia be different? Multiple reasons, as it turned out. Russia's size, Russia's ability to relocate industry beyond German reach, Russia's willingness to absorb catastrophic losses, Russia's brutal winter, Russia's mud seasons, the resilience of the Soviet system, the motivation of a population fighting for survival. But Hitler, drunk on previous victories, discounted all of this. He predicted victory within weeks or months. He told commanders to pack for a swift campaign, not a prolonged war. The result was catastrophic. The Battle of Stalingrad alone cost Germany an entire army. 300,000 men surrendered in February 1943 after months of brutal urban combat. Hitler's refusal to authorize retreat until too late turned defeat into annihilation. Operation Barbarossa succeeded tactically in many ways, advancing deep into Soviet territory and inflicting massive casualties. But strategically it failed completely because Hitler, like Napoleon 130 years earlier, believed that his previous successes had made him immune to the basic rules of warfare. The pattern held: overconfidence, dismissal of warnings, underestimation of the opponent, assumption that past formulas guarantee future success. And the result held too: catastrophic loss, strategic defeat, and ultimately the beginning of the end for Hitler's regime. So what can we learn from this? Because these aren't just history lessons. These patterns still play out today in military, business, and political contexts. The fundamentals of overconfidence haven't changed, even if the technology has. First lesson: past success is not predictive. The fact that a strategy worked before doesn't mean it'll work again, especially against a different opponent in different circumstances. Custer's tactics at Washita were suicide at Little Bighorn. Napoleon's methods in Prussia were disaster in Russia. Each situation requires fresh analysis, not template application. Second lesson: listen to dissenting voices, especially experts close to the problem. Custer's scouts knew those warriors. The French marshals understood the terrain. Napoleon's logistics officers saw the supply problems. These weren't pessimists or cowards, they were people with relevant knowledge. When multiple informed voices are raising the same concern, that's data, not negativity. Third lesson: the more confident you feel, the more you should question your assumptions. Confidence isn't bad, overconfidence is. And the distinction is often invisible from inside your own perspective. If a decision feels obvious, if opposition seems foolish, if success seems guaranteed, that's precisely when you need to slow down and stress test your thinking. Fourth lesson: understand your opponent's incentives and capabilities, not just your own strengths. Napoleon knew his own army was superior. What he didn't sufficiently account for was Russia's willingness to trade space for time. The French at Agincourt knew they outnumbered the English. What they didn't account for was how terrain would neutralize that advantage. Understanding what you can do is useful. Understanding what your opponent can do is essential. Fifth lesson: defeat often comes not from doing the wrong thing, but from doing the previously right thing in the wrong context. Custer's aggressive tactics had worked. Napoleon's decisive battle strategy had worked. French cavalry charges had worked. These weren't inherently bad approaches, they were good approaches applied to situations where they didn't fit. The danger isn't incompetence, it's competence applied without adaptation. And here's the deeper truth that makes all of this so relevant today. Overconfidence isn't a military problem, it's a human problem. It shows up in business leaders who miss market shifts because past products succeeded. It shows up in politicians who misjudge public sentiment because previous campaigns won. It shows up in personal relationships where past patterns blind people to present realities. The generals we've discussed lost because they were too confident, yes. But specifically, they were too confident in their ability to control variables that were actually outside their control. Custer couldn't control Native American tactical decisions. Napoleon couldn't control Russian strategy or geography. The French nobles couldn't control battlefield terrain. Hitler couldn't control Soviet industrial capacity or willingness to sustain losses. What they could control, and failed to, was their own decision-making process. They could have sought more information. They could have listened to warnings. They could have adapted plans. They could have acknowledged uncertainty. Instead, they let confidence harden into certainty, and certainty is where flexibility dies. The deadliest phrase in military history isn't "we're outnumbered" or "we're outgunned," it's "victory is certain." Because once you believe that, you stop gathering intelligence, you stop listening to advisors, you stop adapting to circumstances, you stop thinking critically about your own assumptions, you become the architect of your own defeat. Custer died believing he was minutes from victory. Napoleon retreated from Moscow still thinking he could salvage the campaign with one more battle. The French nobles at Agincourt charged into that muddy field absolutely certain they'd break the English lines. Hitler refused to authorize retreat from Stalingrad because he was convinced German troops would prevail. They were all wrong. And they were all wrong for the same reason. They'd mistaken confidence for competence and past success for future guarantee. The military historian John Keegan once wrote that the true test of generalship isn't winning when conditions favor you, it's recognizing when conditions don't and adjusting accordingly. The generals who lost wars by being too confident failed that test spectacularly. They had the courage to fight. They had the will to win. What they lacked was the humility to question whether their confidence was justified. And that humility, that willingness to doubt yourself even when you're at the peak of your power, might be the rarest quality in military leadership, because it requires you to hold two opposing thoughts simultaneously: confidence in your abilities and awareness of your fallibility. Most commanders can manage one or the other. The truly great ones manage both. So the next time you're absolutely certain about something, a business decision, a relationship assumption, a career move, remember these stories. Remember that smart, experienced, successful people can be catastrophically wrong when confidence overwhelms judgment. Remember that the most dangerous moment isn't when you doubt yourself, it's when you don't. Because somewhere in Montana in 1876, a decorated cavalry officer looked at a massive Native American village and saw an easy victory. In northern France in 1415, French nobles looked at a starving English army and saw target practice. Outside Moscow in 1812, Napoleon looked at the Russian winter approaching and saw an inconvenience. They were all wrong, and they were all too confident to see it.